The French are obsessed with driving in circles. Home to approximately 65,000 roundabouts, around 500 new circular intersections are built throughout the country every year. That's more traffic circles than any other nation on Earth, including the US, which has over 15 million intersections, but only about 7,000 of those intersections are roundabouts. And French roundabouts hold so much more than zippy Citroëns and lumbering buses. They are the home of strange giant yellow ants, symbols of middle-class alienation, and ground zero for the most violent political uprising in France in 50 years. In order to understand how the roundabout has radically shaped French life, you need to understand that in 1905, traffic in the city of Paris was a total nightmare. One of the most dangerous and congested places to circulate was the Place de l'Étoile, with Napoleon's famous Arc de Triomphe in its center. It was as if the daily traffic around the monument were an unending parade celebrating the conquering hero. With 12 avenues like the points of a star spread out from the arc, and traffic from each of those 12 roads converging onto it, in 1905, there were literally no rules at all for how to enter or exit the huge 12-lane circuit. And once you were inside the circle, you could go in any direction you wanted. Horse-drawn carriages and cars would enter and head in clockwise and counterclockwise directions at the same time. There were head-on collisions, traffic jams. It was complete chaos. But then, architect and urban planner Eugène Hénard came up with a solution. He decided traffic should go around the circle in one direction only, anti-clockwise, in order to make way for vehicles entering from the right. But the étoile is an edge case in the world of roundabouts. This is because when you enter the étoile, the entering vehicle actually has the right of way. This is called priority to the right. Priority to the right means everyone already inside the circle has to slow down, swerve, or come to a sudden stop to get out of the oncoming car's way. Inside the étoile, a tiny car can bring a giant bus to an abrupt halt. Traffic clogs in the center lanes closest to the arc. If you look down from the top, cars below look like schools of darting fish, or, during rush hour, ants in a death spiral. But in 1915, British traffic engineer Frank Blackmore innovated the modern roundabout in the UK, where you yield to the traffic already inside the circle. Now, the vehicles inside didn't have to stop for oncoming vehicles, which kept traffic in the circle flowing smoothly. Thanks to Blackmore's innovation, the majority of modern roundabouts are incredibly safe. Their ingenious design helps to explain, at least partly, why the French have built so many. At an intersection, any spot where two vehicles could potentially collide is called a conflict point. Anywhere two vehicles' paths merge, diverge, or cross. A four-way or standard cross intersection has a total of 32 conflict points. Replace that intersection with a single-lane roundabout and the number drops to 8. Thanks to this dramatic reduction in conflict points, intersections converted from traffic signals or stop signs to roundabouts reduce fatal injury crashes up to 80%, with a total crash reduction of almost half. Timing is everything at a signalized intersection, especially for cars needing to turn left. If the driver does not time the turn correctly or misjudges the speed of the oncoming traffic, they're vulnerable to a very high-speed side impact collision. Consider the same scenario in a roundabout. Because of the roundabout's circular design, the two cars' paths will never cross as they enter and exit the roundabout. The roundabout completely eliminates the conflict crossing point and the possibility for a serious accident. When there are more cars in the intersection, the complexity and the potential for danger increase considerably. Take a look at this scenario. Cars approach a signalized intersection. The light turns red, and the cars stop, except for one car, where the driver is texting. The car with the distracted driver rear-ends the car in front of it, pushing the hapless driver directly into the intersection, which already has traffic moving through it. This same scenario in a roundabout, though, plays like a beautiful symphony, with each vehicle traveling in the same direction, eliminating the chance for head-on collisions. And because the cars yield instead of stopping at the roundabout entrance, the chance of a rear end is minimal. Because of these significant benefits to traffic flow and public safety, roundabouts spread across France at a rapid rate. And then, in the 1980s, the central government handed off road management to local mayors. As a result, the already popular circular intersection became even more prolific. But to some French citizens and confused US tourists, there were too many roundabouts in France, and their proliferation has more to do with vanity than with practicality. This is because, according to Professor Eric Alonso, author of Du Rond-Point au Girotoire, some local mayors saw the roundabout as a kind of fashionable object. I heard from technicians who weren't necessarily recommending that solution for traffic problems, but elected officials were saying, "I want one anyway." Speaking of fashion, during this time, something else, something inside the roundabouts, also proliferated. In the center of each roundabout is a void, and inside that void is an opportunity. Local mayors began to commission giant and sometimes bizarre sculptures to fill the space in the center of each roundabout. Just as Australia's big things, like the giant koala and the big merino, have a distinctly Aussie vibe, and US roadside attractions like Christ of the Ozarks and Carhenge, a Stonehenge made entirely of cars, embody something distinctively American, French roundabout sculptures possess a certain French je ne sais quoi. A roundabout near a beach in Saint-Jouin-Bruneval, France, holds a statue of a pebble collector and his horse, a reference to the town's history, when pebbles used to be brought up from the cliff on horseback to be sold. In another town that exports snails for escargot, a roundabout sculpture of a giant snail on a piece of lettuce gazes into a mirror, for reasons known only to the artist and possibly the snail. Roundabout art can be found across the world, but as for France, not everyone in the country loves its roundabout art. There are even contests to vote on the worst ones, with winners like this weird arm with cars crashing to the ground, terrifying drivers in Châtellerault, and this mysterious sausage and donut in Montpellier. And over time, the attitude toward roundabouts started changing into something far darker than a skepticism toward oversized pine cones. In August 1999, the US and France were locked in an acrimonious trade dispute. The US had enacted sanctions against France in order to pressure France to import American hormone-treated beef, which France had banned due to possible risks to human health. In response, small sheep farmer and political activist José Bove, along with members from the second-largest farmers' union in France, vandalized a French McDonald's, protesting what Bove called the McDomination of France. During the second half of the 20th century, globalization had rapidly shifted the world into a network of interconnected trade and technology. In France, and in other countries such as the US and England, foods once cultivated locally were being imported from elsewhere, while entire industries were moving their operations to other countries in search of cheap labor and lower production costs. The people of France fiercely value their culture and identity, their foods, arts, language, their infrastructure. McDonald's, or as the French call it, McDo, with its iconic golden arches and assembly line French fries and Big Macs, was a prime example of Americanization, threatening to homogenize France and the world into one giant chicken nugget. As McDonald's McDominated throughout France, generating the second highest revenue worldwide for the multinational corporation, so did the cars that drove through the fast food giant's drive-through windows. Post-World War II in France, much like the US, there had been a push toward car ownership. In the ensuing decades, suburbia sprawled, people moved out of city centers, and France broke into separate, isolated spaces. The trains and footpaths of the past were increasingly abandoned, as people in suburban areas had to rely more and more heavily on their vehicles, which took them daily on one roundabout after another to and from their jobs. Anthropologist Marc Auger came up with a theory to describe transient spaces where human beings are anonymous and isolated, stripped of a sense of social identity and belonging. He called his theory non-place theory. According to Auger, shopping malls, airport terminals, highways, and roundabouts are all non-places. Consider the roundabout. While you are driving in it, you never directly cross paths with another car. You're isolated in your vehicle, whereas on a train or a walking path, you'd be within the bustle of the crowd. Unlike the possibility of deep contemplation you might experience with a sculpture in a park or a painting in a museum, roundabout art quickly whizzes by. Even the exits on a roundabout all point in opposite directions, visually splitting a town into disconnected parts. And so, more and more roundabouts popped up in France, as the suburbs filled with identical chain supermarkets and shopping malls. Traditional bakers and butchers disappeared, and the trance-like spirals of the roundabouts transformed into striking symbols of middle-class alienation. Things came to a boiling point in 2018, when French President Emmanuel Macron, who citizens dubbed President of the Very Rich, and who held just a 25% approval rating at the time, enacted a controversial fuel tax. He said it would be used to finance France's transition to a green economy. But it soon became clear that the proceeds would mostly be used to plug a budget deficit widened by the government's tax cuts for the wealthy. This infuriated motorists in rural and suburban areas bereft of public transportation and other services, where households are heavily reliant on their cars, areas where people drove through roundabouts every day to and from their jobs. In France, not needing a car is a kind of status symbol that only those in major cities with plentiful public transportation can afford. In January of 2018, a bricklayer named Leandro Antonio Noguera, who lived in a rural area, the département, or administrative region of France called Dordogne, started the very first Facebook anger group. And then someone else in another département started another. The formation of Facebook anger groups by administrative region directly coincided with a shift in Facebook's algorithm, and it was this confluence of events, the anger groups plus the algorithm, which would lead to the start of the biggest violent protests France had seen in over half a century. Facebook's algorithm had just started emphasizing local networks and prioritizing posts from friends and family. The social media platform said this was in order to combat passive consumption, misinformation, and political polarization, although critics thought it was a desperate attempt to revive a dying platform. One unexpected result of the Facebook algorithm change was that local French anger groups spread across French Facebook at breakneck speed. Initially, the groups organized a dozen or so small protests by administrative region, ranging in focus from labor law reforms to reducing the speed limits on busy roads. They weren't specifically about the fuel tax, and the protests seemed to quickly die out. Then, in May 2018, Priscilla Ludowski, an organic cosmetics entrepreneur, posted a petition to change.org, taking issue with Macron's fuel tax. Though her petition only garnered 1,500 signatures initially, Ludowski was invited on a local radio station to talk about it. Her radio appearance was then written up by a local news site. That news article, the one about her radio appearance, was shared to a local Facebook page, where everyone was talking about it, thanks to the algorithm's boost of local conversations. Two truck drivers, Eric Drouet and Bruno Lefebvre, who lived in the same suburb as Ludowski, decided to turn Ludowski's petition into a Facebook event called the National Blockage Against Rising Fuel. The date they scheduled for the event was November 17th, 2018. On that day, November 17th, as Ludowski's petition continued to circulate and amass signatures online, having passed the 1 million mark, mass demonstrations broke out on the center islands of roundabouts in suburban and rural areas outside of major cities like Paris and Marseille. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future Posit videos. Hundreds of thousands of health workers, construction workers, small business owners, retirees whose pensions had been cut, took to the streets to protest, united by their precarious working conditions and their feeling of invisibility to the elites who ran the country. They argued that a disproportionate burden of taxation in France was falling on the working and middle classes, especially in rural and peri-urban areas, calling for a repeal of the green tax on fuel, a reintroduction of the solidarity tax on wealth, and a minimum wage increase, among other demands. On the 29th of November 2018, a list of 42 demands went viral on social media. By law, yellow vests are required to be kept in all vehicles in France to wear during emergency situations. The protesters chose them as a unifying thread and call to arms. Roundabouts, like the yellow vests, also became a symbol for the protesters, and the France of roundabouts became shorthand to describe the small cities and towns in peripheral France where the movement began. As the movement unfolded, roundabouts became more than mere symbols, however, transforming from non-spaces into actual places, encampments for the protesters to gather and organize, as well as to protest, with fires for cooking, a pétanque court for playing, and makeshift buildings to store pasta and coffee. Drivers going through the roundabouts honked in support. Then, during a protest in Marseille on December 1, 2018, the police fired a tear gas canister into the crowd, just as an 80-year-old Algerian woman, Zeynep Rouedouane, was closing the shutters on the 4th floor of her apartment building. The canister hit her in the face, and she died. Her death sparked outrage and further protests, with many calling for an investigation, for the police officers responsible to be held accountable. The police initially denied using tear gas at the protest, but later admitted to using it, claiming it was necessary to disperse violent protesters. Zeynep Rouedouane was not the only tragic casualty of the police's use of excessive force. 11 others were killed, and thousands injured. The police turned rubber bullets and stun grenades on the French populace, even aiming rubber bullets at protesters' faces, causing some people to lose their eyes. And the violence was not contained to the police. In Paris, anarchists called casseurs, or smashers in English, defaced the Arc de Triomphe under the umbrella of the movement, which had no hierarchical organizational structure and, thanks to the porousness of its architecture on Facebook groups, easily allowed for bad actors to infiltrate. This included conspiracy theorists who used the movement to spread their theories. The casseurs looted shops, vandalized buildings, and attacked police. At one point, they even scaled the Arc de Triomphe, and several times they lit vehicles on fire. France has a long history of violent protest, going back to the French Revolution. In 1789, the country was drowning in debt due to Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette's extravagant spending, coupled with the American War of Independence, during which France allied itself to the US at great financial cost. In a turn of events eerily similar in some ways to those that were to unfold over 200 years later, taxes were imposed on France's commoners, while the clergy and nobility enjoyed tax exemptions. A population already crushed by mandatory tithing, poor harvests, and the rising price of flour pushed back with extreme aggression and violence. And on July 14, 1789, the people captured the Bastille prison, a symbol of the monarchy. Just 3.5 years later, they beheaded the king, abolished feudalism, and established the country's first constitution. Ever since the French Revolution, the ghosts of monarchists who died under the guillotine have haunted generations of politicians. The ferocious spirit of the French Revolution has invigorated protest movements, including the Yellow Vest movement, reminding President Macron just who the people were he was supposed to represent. The Yellow Vest protesters achieved some of their goals, such as getting Macron to repeal the green tax and raise pensions for retirees. The protests lasted for 60 consecutive weeks. In fall of 2019, whispers of a mysterious pneumonia-like illness began to spread across the globe. Then, the world shut down. The lockdown led to the collapse of the Yellow Vest movement, though the movement's ripple effects continue. In 2023, perhaps in part as payback for the pension reform the Yellow Vest protests had brought about, President Macron released his plan to increase the retirement age from 62 to 64. Protests once again broke out across the country. France's special Bravem motorbike police unit, a unit of motorcycle cops specially trained to prevent protests from spiraling out of control, have been accused of taking the law into their own hands, intimidating and threatening people, and in some cases, resorting to the use of excessive force. Throughout it all, the construction of new roundabouts continues, holding within their circles layers of French history and identity. We are a small team at Posit, If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, you can buy us a coffee. Go to the link in the description to show your support. Thanks so much for watching.